My name is Thomas Rayner. I am a landscape architect and a writer. I think as a kid, we lived in the suburbs of Birmingham, Alabama, and our house backed up to a lot of woods. And so much of my first experience of plants were not as horticultural specimens, they were more just play spaces we had as kids. I remember particularly there's kind of a grove of sparkleberry, Ilex arborea, that were really dense together, and we kind of felt like rabbits running through. There's a beech grove that even with a pack of feral boys I hung out with, we all kind of felt a little more reverent underneath just because the spaces were so interesting. So it's kind of how plants made spaces was really my first experience. So it was a love of the wild that really was a big part of what drew me to plants. And then later on, I worked in a nursery when I was from middle school all the way through college. So it was a great way of kind of learning the horticultural side of plants and loving the joy that selling plants brings to people as well. Plants in the wild, they grow in communities of interrelated plants, and so they're really social creatures. I think so much, it sounds obvious to say, but so much of when you think about how we buy plants in the trade, they're sold individually, and you kind of, as a designer or as a gardener, you can pick anything you want based on usually ornamental characteristics, and we reassemble them in our yards. But whether you're walking by a weed patch or you're walking through a hike in the woods, what you really notice is how social plants are, how plants cover the ground, and how different plants fulfill different roles. You have your kind of charismatic, upright bloomers that you always notice. You have your kind of quieter workhorses, these ground cover plants that kind of hold the ground and nothing we notice a lot, but very functional. You have big trees and shrubs which become kind of the framework, the structure that holds it all together. So it really is a community of different actors, and over time in the wild, they've sorted themselves out into different niches. It's not that they don't compete. They still do compete, and it's probably a rather brutal world for them. It's not total harmony out in the forest and the meadows, but there is a sorting that's happened, and so plants are in different niches, so they're avoiding directly competing as much as possible. And that adds a certain amount of stability that we really don't have in our design landscapes. I really love native plants and just see their potential in a design setting a whole lot. But the philosophy, I think, started to emerge because I think I was increasingly frustrated by how few great examples of native gardens we had out in the world. I mean, we're hearing more and more of their value in terms of ecosystem services, in terms of pollinators, in terms of larval host plants, but there are not a ton of examples of plant gardens that are just stunningly beautiful. And when I'm trying to sell a client on these plants, sometimes some of the bad examples they've seen in rain gardens that have failed, or elementary school pollinator gardens that you can hardly tell is a garden at all, does more damage than good. So I became very interested in understanding how we could translate these plants into horticultural settings. It really started off more as a practical challenge. How can we create plantings really in small spaces? I mean, a lot of what I'm designing are not huge, expansive restorations. These are human landscapes. How can we take the patterns of what happens in the wild and make it attractive? How do we get as many blooms as possible in there? How do we deal with the fact that some things that bloom don't last that long and we need something else that blooms? How do we put plants together? It's just a kind of a practical challenge. And I think out of understanding some of the answers to that came more of a philosophy. So actually the practical, pragmatic challenge preceded the big idea. It was kind of, the solution was kind of a big philosophy as well. So that was kind of neat to see how that happened. I think I'm interested in getting more plants into our design landscapes, more beneficial plants. And making people connect with those plants in a deeper way. And for me, the way to do that is to not only kind of say what those beneficial plants are. I think a lot of people are talking about the value of things like natives and other plants that have ecological services, but to really show people how they can put plants together in a way that deals with some of the practical problems they have in their yards or in their landscapes with management, with design. And so, it's just getting more life, and then getting more pleasure out of that life on the human end. I think there's a huge potential for the merging of traditional horticulture and all the great things that has brought, the nursery industry, plant breeding, the advancements we have with that, the focus on beauty with ecological principles. And one of the things I've been disturbed by is sometimes stumbling in social media sites where the native plant advocates are arguing with kind of people who love peonies and dahlias. And so, like a lot of the American public discourse, it's become very polarized. And so, I hate that it's become polarized, because I really think the future is not going to be either or, it's going to be both and. That gardeners can keep their peonies and roses, but we can add. There's so much room to add more life, particularly in our suburban landscapes. That it's really when horticulture understands the value of using more ecological principles, more plants that aren't just the most showy, overbred divas in the world, more valuable biodiversity, and then when ecology, the native plant understands that aesthetics matter, that these can't just be for the bugs and pollinators, they have to look really good in human landscapes. And it's that overlap of ecology and horticulture when that happens. And I think it is starting to happen. I think when you see a project like the High Line in New York, the most visited site in Manhattan, you start to understand that more and more as we urbanize, people want a connection to a bit of wildness, a connection to a bit of something that they don't see every single day. So bedding plants are just not going to do that for people all the time. So I think there's an opening that's happening culturally in what we want as we urbanize. And so I think the time is really right for a renaissance in horticulture. And I think that'll only happen when both sides see the value of the other side and the potential of that. And when that happens, I think it'll be a great day for horticulture, because I think we'll move out of the shadows of just ornamenting and putting parsley around the pot roast, and really people will start understanding plants as essential to healthy urban living. I think with plants, we always have to remember that gardens and landscapes don't endure. Their point is not to last. Their point is not to endure, is to enchant. And I am a big advocate of plantings being pleasurable at all points. So there's a lot of seriousness that we get into when we talk about kind of native plants and how beneficial those can be. But I think people should just remember we plant and we get plants because they do bring pleasure to us. And that's always, I don't want to forget that in all the kind of seriousness we have in terms of the challenges that face our future before. I think the great thing about plants is they can do it all. They can clean our stormwater, they can bring life to cities, but they can just be really enjoyable for us.